We hear a lot about federal help after big disasters, right? But how does that actually, kick off?
Yeah, it's a really important process.
So today we're doing a deep dive into presidential declarations for major disasters or emergencies. This is basically the key that unlocks federal aid when a state or territory or tribal government is just overwhelmed.
Exactly. It's fundamental. So our mission today is to sort of trace the path of that declaration, what triggers it, what it actually means, and why it's so vital for getting communities back on their feet.
And we're using FEMA's own course materials for this,
Yeah.
right? Getting it straight from the source.
That's the plan, official guidelines on the process.
Okay, so let's jump in. Where does it start? When does a state or another government say, okay, we need the feds? What's the trigger?
Well, it really begins right there. At the state, territorial, or tribal level, they have to make the call that an incident is just too big for their own resources to handle effectively.
They realize they're outmatched.
Pretty much. And often that leads to something called a joint preliminary damage assessment, a PDA.
PDA.
Yeah.
Okay, what's involved in that? Sounds official.
It is. Think of it like a joint fact-finding effort. You get officials from the federal government, the state or territory or tribe, and even some nonprofits, all working together.
Ah, so everyone gets eyes on the situation?
Exactly. They go out, they evaluate the damage, estimate the costs, figure out the overall impact. It's about getting real data.
So it's not just, wow, this looks bad. It's quantified.
Right. It makes the whole request for aid much more objective based on, actual assessments.
Okay, makes sense. So you've got this PDA data. Who actually picks up the phone, metaphorically speaking, and asks the president for help?
That responsibility falls to the governor of the state or the tribal chief executive for a tribal government.
They make the formal request.
Yes. They basically lay out the case using that PDA info and other factors, explaining why federal help is needed because their own capacity is exceeded.
Is there a time limit on this? Disasters are chaotic. Getting that assessment done must take time.
There is a time frame, yeah. Generally, that request needs to go to the president within 30 days of the incident happening.
30 days.
But FEMA understands that sometimes, especially in really catastrophic situations, putting together that assessment takes longer.
Sure, it could be impossible to even access some areas.
Exactly. So the governor or tribal chief executive can submit a written request for an extension explaining why they need more time.
So there's some flexibility built in.
Definitely. And there's another mechanism, too, for really severe, fast-moving events.
Ooh, what's that?
It's called an expedited declaration request. Sometimes the situation is so obviously catastrophic, think like a massive hurricane bearing down.
Right, you know it's going to be bad.
You know it. In those cases, they can ask for a declaration much faster based on rapid initial reports, even before the full PDA is finished.
Ah, so you can get some help flowing immediately.
Precisely. It allows for limited but crucial immediate assistance, things like search and rescue, maybe emergency shelters, while the more detailed assessments are still underway.
Okay, that seems critical in those worst-case scenarios. So the request goes in, maybe expedited, maybe with a full PDA. The president agrees. What does that declaration actually do? What does it spell out?
Right. The declaration itself is a formal statement, and it defines several key things. First, it names the type of incident.
Like Hurricane Zeta or Midwest flooding.
Exactly. Tornado, flood, earthquake, whatever it is. Second, it sets the incident period.
The time frame when the disaster officially happened for federal purposes.
The start and end dates of the federally recognized event. And this can vary, a flood might last longer than a tornado strike.
Okay, type of incident period, what else?
Really important. The designated areas. It lists the specific counties, parishes, cities, or tribal lands that are eligible to receive assistance.
So only those listed places get help.
Initially, yes. But FEMA can add more areas later. If more damage is found, the state or tribe can request additions within 30 days of the declaration or the end of the incident period, whichever's later. They just need to justify the delay.
Good to know there's a way to adjust that. What about the actual help itself?
The declaration specifies the types of assistance authorized. This usually falls into two big buckets.
Okay.
Individual assistance, or IA, and public assistance, PA.
IA and PA. What's the difference?
Well, individual assistance is just what it sounds like, help for individuals and households. Think temporary housing, grants for essential needs, maybe disaster unemployment.
Help for people directly impacted.
Correct. And public assistance PA that's aimed at state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, plus certain private nonprofits.
So rebuilding infrastructure and stuff.
Exactly. Debris removal, repairing roads, bridges, public buildings, water treatment plants, emergency protective measures taken during the event, that kind of thing.
Got it. People and public stuff. Does the declaration say how much the federal government will pay?
Yes, it outlines the federal cost share. For public assistance, the baseline is typically the federal government covering at least 75% of the eligible costs.
That's 75%. That's significant.
It is. And FEMA can actually recommend bumping that up, sometimes to 90%, if the disaster meets certain criteria for severity and cost. There are also specific, limited cases where the share for emergency work can be increased.
Okay, so the financial commitment is spelled out. One more piece.
Yes, the declaration names the Federal Coordinating Officer, the FCO.
FCO. Who are they?
Think of the FCO as the primary federal leader on the ground. They partner with the state coordinating officer, or the tribal equivalent, and the governor's or tribal leader's representative.
So they're running the federal show locally.
They're coordinating it, making sure all the different federal agencies and programs are working together effectively with the state, tribal, and local efforts. It's a huge coordination role.
That makes sense. You need someone steering the ship. Okay, so we have the trigger, the request, the declaration details, IA, PA, cost share, FCO. Let's talk a bit more about those formalities after the declaration. Is it automatic once declared, or are there more steps?
Oh, there are definitely more steps. It's not just, okay, here's the money. For public assistance, the state, territory, or tribe that received the declaration needs to formally apply.
Apply again after getting the declaration?
Well, they need to submit the standard application for federal funding. It's Form SF-424, Application for Federal Assistance. It's a standard government process.
Okay, SF-424, bureaucracy.
Right, part of the process. And if it's the very first time a tribal government has received a declaration directly from the president.
Yes.
A special case. They also need to submit a couple more forms, SF-1199A, which sets up access to the payment system, and a direct deposit form. Basically getting the financial plumbing set up so FEMA can send funds through HHS's payment management system.
Right, gotta get the bank details sorted. Anything else major?
Yes, arguably the most critical piece after the declaration. The state, territory, or tribe must enter into a FEMA state territory tribe agreement.
An agreement.
Yeah.
What does that cover?
It's the formal understanding. It lays out all the commitments, the conditions, the rules of the road for how FEMA assistance will be provided and managed.
Kind of like the operating manual for this specific disaster response.
That's a good way to put it. And the governor or the tribal chief executive has to sign this agreement before most FEMA assistance, especially the big PA funding, can really start flowing.
So that agreement is key to unlocking the funds.
Absolutely critical. It sets the stage for everything that follows.
Are there any exceptions? Can any help start before that agreement is signed? It seems like it could take time.
There can be, yes. For truly urgent needs. FEMA might, for instance, authorize some essential emergency services or maybe some immediate housing help under the Individuals and Households program while that main agreement is still being finalized.
So there's a little wiggle room for life-saving stuff.
Exactly. They recognize you can't always wait for every I to be dotted when lives are on the line.
Okay, good. Now we've got the declaration, the forms, the agreement. What does the coordination actually look like on the ground right after things get started? Where do people work?
Well, initially, you might have FEMA personnel working out of the existing state or Tribal Emergency Operations Center, the EOC.
Alongside the state folks already there.
Right. Sharing information, starting the initial coordination. But often, for a major event, they need a more dedicated, unified space.
And that leads to?
That often leads to establishing a Joint Field Office, or JFO.
JFO. Heard that term before.
Yeah, it's basically a central hub. FEMA sets it up in coordination with the state or tribe. It becomes the main place where all the key players, federal, state, tribal, sometimes local, co-locate.
Everyone under one roof, working together.
That's the idea. Streamlines communication, improves coordination for both the immediate response and the longer-term recovery activities.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up then. It starts when a disaster is just too big for local resources.
Leading to damage assessments, the PDA.
Then the governor or tribal chief executive makes that formal request, usually within 30 days, unless they get an extension.
Or they use the expedited process for really bad situations.
Right. Then comes the presidential declaration, which is the key. Specifies the incident, the dates, the places.
The types of aid, like individual and public assistance, the federal cost share, and names that crucial federal coordinating officer, the FCO.
Then there's the follow-up paperwork, SF-424, maybe those tribal payment forms,
And absolutely, that vital FEMA state territory tribe agreement that needs to be signed.
which then allows the coordinated work to happen, often out of a joint field office, the JFO.
You've got it. That's a really solid overview of the whole flow. It shows it's a structured process, even if it seems chaotic from the outside.
It really does. It definitely makes you think about all the intense coordination and the detailed assessment work that has to happen behind the scenes, all kicking off from that single declaration. So maybe a final thought for our listeners.
Yes.
Knowing this process, what questions does it spark for you about how well our communities are really prepared and how effective that government response is when the worst happens?